Hello and welcome to this video on Never Let Me Go. I'm going to take you through a student's essay that was done in the 2017 exams. There are 15 things that she does really well. It's an essay that got 30 marks out of 30. And what's interesting is it's not a perfect essay, okay? You'll find some errors in it, and that doesn't matter under exam conditions. These 15 skills do. Now, you'll notice that I haven't put the title of the essay up, and there's a very good reason for that. Whatever the essay, whatever the question is, it's always about the author's purpose. So here the author is Ishiguro, and quite rightly, she's begun her introduction by looking at Ishiguro's purpose and relating that to the question. So perhaps Ishiguro wrote Never Let Me Go to imply that our minds have been conditioned to work one way, the only acceptable way through society's eyes. This is shown by the exclusion of reality from the clones. They're manufactured, sent to school, and then murdered, or, as the dystopian society puts it, completion. So you can see that she explains what Ishiguro's purpose is. Uh, she's included as much technical vocabulary that relates to the novel as she can. So conditioned. She's talked about the genre of the novel as dystopian. She's followed my advice to always write about society because that is always the author's purpose. Um, Authors are always writing about the societies they live in. And if you think about it, that's logical. They can't help it. Those are the societies they know about. So even science fiction, in a future sense, is still a way of writing about the society you're in now. At the end of the novel, Kathy is stood by her car watching the landscape. Kathy begins to think about her past, and tears roll down her face as she began to realize the true meaning of her life, to unwillingly donate her vital organs. Perhaps Ishiguro does this to emphasize society's control over the clones' minds. Kathy never thinks badly about society, and so we'll pause it there. So again, you can see that society keeps coming up as a motif, a regular thing that she keeps writing about. And that means that she's always in the top of the mark band. The other skills that you'll notice, hopefully, is the embedded quotations that simply fit into her sentence. There's one there, there's one here. As we go through the essay, you'll start to notice how often she uses colons to introduce explanations. There's one there, and there's one here. You'll spot these as we go through. There's another one here, and it's a sophisticated way of telling the examiner that you're fully in control of your argument. Okay, let's see where else she goes. Uh, Perhaps because she is scared of angering society, as she does not know what they will do to her. Although Kathy is crying, I wasn't sobbing or out of control, which could imply how badly society has affected her. Clones aren't supposed to have souls, so she can't even break down emotionally. This further excludes the clones from the everyday normality of society, as they can't even cry without disgusting real people around them. Perhaps this could imply Ishiguro's opinions on racial discrimination. People of color are still treated as rejects, just like the clones. This implies that Ishiguro believes we should all be treated equally. Everyone deserves to go out of control and to show real emotions. So here we've got an alternative interpretation, and that is conveyed through the use of the connective. And if you use although and however in your essay, you will always give alternative interpretations, and you will always get into the higher levels of the mark scheme. You will also notice all the way through she keeps using this word perhaps, and this use of tentative language is just a little trick, if you like, to force you to offer alternative interpretations again. This could imply. So again, that shows the examiner that you're exploring, and being exploratory is always at the top of the mark scheme. You should also notice as we go through that she keeps using the words implies instead of shows. I think she used shows right at the beginning, but then hit her stride. And it's just another way to use a sophisticated vocabulary to make the examiner think you are an expert. Now, the other sophisticated thing she does is she makes a link between this imagined society in Never Let Me Go and the racial discrimination that is experienced in our own society. And this works even though there are no um, different races presented in the novel. And one of the reasons you could argue that Ishiguro doesn't present any different races is in order to show that they are discriminated against. And so this is a kind of ironic way of discriminating, not putting them in the novel in the first place. But what are they replaced by? Well, they're replaced by the idea of the clones. So the clones come to represent any discriminated group. Um, and Ishiguro, therefore, is arguing that once you discriminate against a group, you take away their humanity, just as the clones are discriminated against and have their humanity taken from them. Now, the other thing that you should really notice here is that she's already been writing about the ending of the novel, and here she's going to refer to the ending of the novel again. That's a really sophisticated thing to do. 95% of students will write about the ending of the novel in the ending of their essay. But because I've taught her and all my students that the author's point of view is most revealed when they get to the ending, she said to herself, well, all right then, so if I want to write about the author's point of view, well, I have to write about the ending as early as possible, don't I? Because that's when I fully explore that point of view. Even after she's been suffering with the loss of Ruth and Tommy because of society, she still goes back to finish her purpose, to drive off to wherever it was I was supposed to be. And I can't overemphasize the importance of this. Whatever novel you're studying, always pick a quotation from the ending that you've memorized, because it will always fit every single essay you ever have to write about that text. And so she has skillfully done this. However, Kathy has changed now. She isn't as suspicious of society anymore and doesn't seem bothered by any of this, conveyed by the use of wherever and supposed. Ishiguro could have done this to imply that society forces idea into your head. Well, I do tell my students that it should be our. The reader is always us and we. Just like when white people saw black people as disgusting and useless, society in this dystopian world views the clones as disposable. And again, just like black people, the clones see themselves as disgusting and abnormal. Now, she doesn't mean that's how black people see themselves all the time. She means that's how society makes the disadvantaged, in this case, black people, when they're disadvantaged, view themselves. Okay, so she's not being racist here. She's saying that's what society does to people. So they see themselves as disgusting and abnormal because they never try to escape or talk to society. They just accept their fates and stay quiet. Perhaps Kathy has changed as society saw her beginning to question their lives, and so society changed her mental state through brainwash or torture. Okay, so what further skills can we revisit? Well, there's that introduction of the connective that forces her to look at an alternative point of view. She's very skillfully embedded quotations here by zooming into words in her longer quotation and shown what they suggest. And again, she's using that sophisticated vocabulary of the expert. She doesn't say this shows, she says conveyed by. Again, using the language of the expert. Ishiguro could have done this. Again, the tentative language to show that she's exploring. Although this seems extreme, she's referring back to the idea of brainwashing and torture, the dystopian society are already harvesting organs. So that should be is, but it doesn't matter in the exam. She's under pressure. She's already harvesting organs, so torture could be second nature to them, which is true. It's a logical point, even though physical torture isn't mentioned in the book at all. This could imply that Ishiguro believes that although our society isn't as extreme, we still subliminally condition people's mind to act as they want us to through adverts and films. Um, so the use of they is a bit imprecise. She could be more precise about that. But here she means elements of society control us. And so advertisers do it through adverts, um, big business conglomerates do it through films, getting us to spend our money watching uh, their movies. But not just that, uh, we've got all this subliminal advertising, so product placement, which affects us without us even being aware a lot of the time, because the products are placed subtly and sometimes not so subtly. Uh, that again is a link to our current society. And that's where she's scoring such high marks. She's taking the context of the novel and saying, well, what is Ishiguro actually trying to say about us? And because she constantly does that, she's always going to get really high marks. Again, the novel mirrors the treatment of black people when Madame says poor little creatures. This implies that society has been conditioned to find the clones abnormal or inhuman, just as white people viewed black people. Ishiguro could be implying that we should make up our own opinions on others rather than allow ourselves to be conditioned by society into being close-minded. So you can see she's really making the case for an anti-racism stance here, um, and she can get away with that because of the sophistication of her writing. She could go further, I suppose. We know that Ishiguro is half Japanese and is very likely to have experienced discrimination due to his race. Um, and or this kind of idea of being an outsider, excluding from a genetic group or a social group, she could easily make that link. She doesn't have to just focus on one minority, if that makes sense. Although Madame calls the clones poor and pities them, she never tries to stop the donations. Perhaps this is because she is also afraid of anger in society or doesn't want to be rejected by society. Ishiguro is perhaps implying we are too selfish and egotistic to care about the quality of other people's lives. Perhaps he is implying that we need to change before we cause each other too much pain. So this is quite a sophisticated argument because Madame represents the authority figures in society. And what the student is implying here is that our authority figures are the same. They themselves need to be uh, accepted by society in order to keep that position of authority. Um, and you could explore that further because the setting is a school, uh, and many of my students looked at Hailsham and said, well, when Ishiguro looks at, when he creates Hailsham, he's actually criticizing the whole education system and saying that our British education system turns its students into clones, takes away their personality, in a way it takes away their souls, and it turns them into drones and copies of each other who are just full of useless information, just like these students don't get any information, actually, they just get art and sport. So perhaps he's implying that we need to change the education system as well. You could argue that. Right, the change in Kathy's behaviour juxtaposes her younger self. She was always questioning her childhood and her purpose, but never acting on her theories. This implies that society had already brainwashed her through the guardians who cared for the clones. They always looked after the clones and held weekly medicals of some sort. So she's getting quite sophisticated here and starting to compare one part of the novel to the next. So by dealing with the ending first, she's now able to delve into Kathy's younger self, and she's using that sophisticated vocabulary, contrast here, signaled by the word juxtaposes. Again, you've got the use of implies all the way through. You've got the embedded quotations all the way through, and you can just feel the sophistication of her answer just by the way she keeps repeating these skills. Although this seems kind at first, these medicals were actually to check their vital organs were still healthy and functioning correctly, which again suggests how selfish we are as a society. So you can see she's referring back to that earlier point about Madame being egotistical and representing the authority figures in society. Now she's arguing that Madame also represents the rest of us. We will do anything to save ourselves. We never see what happens if a clone was to have unhealthy organs, perhaps to imply how easily this could be hidden, or to show how much control the dystopian society has over the clones. The clones are too afraid to drink or smoke. This again excludes them from society, as regular teenagers and children are rebellious and try these dangerous things like alcohol and cigarettes. So this again is a sophisticated point, uh, illustrating that he's deliberately chosen the most rebellious kind of age, the teenage age, to show how far these people have been brainwashed. And again, he's asking that question of whether we do that in our own society. Do we actually brainwash our own children in this way? Not to be clones, but to have other values. So you could argue that he deliberately stops them rebelling to make us see how unnatural that is, and therefore to want teenagers to be rebellious in our society. He could be celebrating teenage behavior as a normal part of growing up. Or you could take the opposite view and say, well, he's probably had a very strict upbringing, um, coming from partly a Japanese background, um, a lifestyle that's dominated by rules and living by the rules of your elders, respecting your elders, and that he still believes that that's the best way to behave, and therefore brainwashing of the young is actually the only way to teach them how to behave as adults. So you could argue it either way. So she has a different interpretation. Again, she signals that with the connective that says, look, examiner, I'm giving you an alternative viewpoint. Then the tentative language, perhaps. Ishiguro is implying how blind we are when it comes to our health. We know we can get a new kidney or heart if ours is too damaged, but do we realize that someone else has to die for us to get this? Perhaps Ishiguro wants us to be more like the clones, to take care of our bodies more and sacrifice more for others. This is an interesting perspective, isn't it? You could look at the clones and say, well, they seem to have nothing and they have short lives which end in death, but yet they seem to be happy. It's not an argument that I would make when I read the novel, certainly, but you could argue it that way. And he could be suggesting, according to her, that this idea of service, serving others in society, will actually make you happy, just like the clones are happy. I don't read the novel that way. I see it as a horrific idea where service to society deprives you of any kind of identity. But that doesn't mean I'm right at all. It's just the way I read the book. At Hailsham, the students are separated from reality by a dark fringe of trees. This keeps the children away from society, never allowing them to understand how the real world works, which could be why they are so uncomfortable when they leave Hailsham. They know nothing else. There are also rumours about the fringe of trees. A student tried to escape but wasn't let back in, and another had his hands and feet cut off. So hopefully she's going to talk about how this is another form of conditioning or brainwashing, as she said earlier as well. We've also got the use of quotations, which I tell my students to remember. This quotation will be relevant whatever the essay, because this is the psychological barrier that Hailsham creates to stop the children escaping and questioning their future. And there are quite a few motifs like this. You can see them in my other videos, these symbols and motifs that appear throughout the book and will fit every single essay there can possibly be. So now she's going to talk about the conditioning. Although Kathy never tells us whether the Guardians created the stories, she does allude to them doing so to keep students inside, afraid of the outside world. This could be to prevent them from running away when they leave Hailsham, which would prevent a body's organs being harvested. Again, Ishiguro could have done this to imply how selfish we are as a society. Parents tell their children scary stories about the bogeyman, perhaps to make them stay, so their parents can condition their minds further. Perhaps Ishiguro did this to imply that we all deserve freedom. Even young children should be allowed to form their own opinions without the influence from parents. So again, you see, she keeps coming back to Ishiguro's purpose, and she keeps putting that purpose in the context of the present day, or at least Ishiguro's present day when he wrote it. So he's writing it for readers now and inventing this dystopian society to comment on his own society now. And that really is a skillful bit of writing. It's what the examiners call seeing the text as a construct. And what they mean by that is the author has constructed it, put it together for a reason, and the reason is always to comment on what society is like now. And that's true even if he'd set it in 1066. The sorts of things he'd be writing about, yes, they'd be about history, but he would be focusing on those aspects in order to illuminate how we think about society right now. And because she keeps coming back to this idea of society all the way through the essay, the examiner can't help but give her really, really high marks. Okay, well, now we've got this really beautiful conclusion, and to be honest, it's a better conclusion even than I thought I'd taught my students to do. She really has outreached my own teaching here. So overall, this dystopian society, again, you'll notice she's always using that expert vocabulary, is frighteningly similar to ours. Perhaps, there's the tentative language again, Ishiguro did this to force us to change our ways, to stop discriminating and conditioning, to allow us to actually have freedom of speech. And what's so sophisticated here is she's giving several purposes. One was this one, two was that one, three is this one, four is coming up. Allow us to form our own opinions on the world. And then five is coming up, without these opinions being tainted by our parents' preferred thoughts or life choices. And now what's interesting for me here is knowing her as I do, this is also partly a comment on the choices that she was facing in terms of what university courses to do. And her parents wanted her to do one thing and she wanted her to do another. And good readers do that. They pull out their own individual experience and apply that to the novel. But she's done it in such a way that this could be agreed by everybody. And perhaps society needs to lose the invisible rein that is holding everyone in the same place and allow us to be free. And this is incredibly sophisticated writing. In the last sentence, I do teach my students to focus on one quotation and to look to the future. And that's exactly what she's done here. She's saying, well, what does Ishiguro want us to be like in the future? Well, actually, he wants children to live in a much freer society. That's her argument. And her symbol for that is this quotation. This is another one of the symbols that I tell my students to remember because it's relevant to every question. The invisible rein, I hope you remember, is the rein that Ruth gives to Kathy when Kathy is allowed to ride the invisible imaginary horse. Yeah, so it represents how Ruth controls Kathy. And further than that, it represents how we all are controlled by things that we don't see, but they control us nevertheless. So, a brilliant essay, not perfect, but it got 30 marks out of 30. you will notice that it is 1,076 words long, and this wasn't done in a mock, it wasn't done at home. This is the actual exam question, answer rather, which I've just typed up. This is exactly what she wrote. Okay, so at this stage, you probably want to revise from this essay because her points will fit nearly any essay that comes up. Not all of the points will be able to crammed into any question, but most of them will. And so will all of these skills that she has used. So you can freeze the screen and study from them. She's always talked about Ishiguro's purpose. She's kept exploring his wider purpose, and by writing about society all the time, she forces the examiner and herself to realize that she's talking about the wider purpose. That's in 3 as well, referring to society. She uses tentative language like perhaps or could all the way through, and that forces her to explore interpretations. She always refers to the genre of the novel, and here it's dystopian, and she's also remembered that dystopian is spelt with a Y. Not all of my students remembered that. Always quote from the ending and interpret the ending. Well, I showed you that as we were reading through. Use connectives which tell the examiner and remind you that you are dealing with alternative interpretations. And she used although and however frequently, especially although. You saw how she embedded her quotations in the sentence. You should also have noticed that she hardly ever used the word shows. She used implies, emphasizes. I don't think she used reveals, conveys. I've put etc. there because there are a range of words you could use instead of shows. Hopefully you picked up on how often she used colons to introduce her explanations. All novels, I tell my students, deal with contrast and juxtaposition. So use these words when they occur, and she used the word juxtaposition. Write a conclusion which deals with how the author wants us to view or change society. She did that really clearly. I'm sure you can remember that far. Try to include a quotation in your last sentence. And then this is really important, these last 2 exam skills. Writing is thinking. One idea leads to the next, so you should trust yourself. Many students don't trust themselves, and so they don't write. They wait for a good idea to come to them, and that simply wastes time and marks. And the other great thing is when you write an idea that's not very good, your mind automatically criticizes it and finds something better to write about. And so your answer just gets better and better if you train yourself to keep writing. So never stop. And then finally, keep writing until your time is up. So this was, I think, a 45-minute question. She would have written for at least 40 minutes, got to the last 5 minutes and thought, right, I've got to get my conclusion in now. And she could plan her conclusion in advance because, well, let's just have a look at it. Yeah, so if the essay was about Kathy, she would be able to have exactly this conclusion because that's Kathy who's held the invisible rain. If it's about Ruth, she could have written this exact conclusion because it's Ruth who handed over this rain. If it's about Ishiguro's point of view, is the novel a tragedy, then, or is it a warning? Whatever it is, well, this is all about Ishiguro's point of view. So actually, she could memorize this conclusion word for word and know that pretty much she could use it whatever the essay question was. And I advise you to do that. You will find when you do that when you do write it, it doesn't come out word for word, but all the key ideas will come out, and so will the key vocabulary. And that's probably an eighth of your essay sitting right there in your memory, ready to come out, no matter what the question. Of course, you might disagree with it and have an alternative conclusion, but the point is still the same. When you write a conclusion that's based on Ishiguro's viewpoint, it will be relevant to every single question that you get, and therefore it's worth planning that conclusion in advance. So what should you do next? Well, I'd just try and write this essay from memory from your notes. Do it now or do it in a day's time, just as you're starting to forget. That will strengthen your memory. And make use of the video that way. Write your own essay in your own words using what you've learnt. If you can do that now, the exam's going to be a breeze, isn't it? Well done for sticking this far. It's been quite a long video because the essay is 30 out of 30 after all. If you want more, don't forget to subscribe.